As David said, my name is Matthew Rogers Draycott. I'll skip this slide because we'll come back to it in a second. And my talk is going to really be about the interplay of family relationships and the process of entrepreneurship. For those of you who know me, I am a lecturer here at the Royal Agricultural University. I specialise in enterprise and entrepreneurship. As a researcher, I'm not actually known for my work on family business. I'm much better known for things I've done in education, in venture creation programs, and most recently running a research project on impact assessment. Family business, I suppose, is almost a dark secret, but it's another string to my bow in that sense. I've been interested in it for a very long time. Dates right back to when I started my PhD, and I should probably put this in some context for you. I've been doing this for quite a long time. I started my PhD nearly a decade ago, and I took a big break in the middle when I left academia and swore I would never return. And here I am. You have David to blame for that. When we were both working together at Worcester, he dragged me back in, and I rekindled my love for this work, and have ended up here at the RAU with him. So for me, this has been a process, I suppose, as well, of rediscovering an element of research that I'm passionate about, but I'd lost my way with somewhat. And I think that's probably, hopefully, what you'll get in some of the narrative today. I'm going to try and tell this just like a story, really. So we'll talk about the research project. I'll explore some of the things I've done and some of the mistakes I've made. And then hopefully I'll give everybody at the end some useful insights into some of the things that are emerging as I move towards the end. And I'm now in the last days of my research. I know David would like me to be much closer to the final days, but he does keep me working on other jobs too. So I hope it will be very interesting for all of you. I'll try to give you all some useful takeaways that talk about how families are being affected and are affecting entrepreneurship. Primarily, probably the latter. It depends how much time we have or how much time I mumble through. So without further ado, we'll try to get moving. My research project has three key aims: develop and understand how entrepreneurs conceptualize family. And although that may not sound important, as this presentation develops, hopefully I can begin to win you over as to why that is something that we really do need to understand. Explore the effects of familial groups on the process of entrepreneurship, and identify the reciprocal effects that entrepreneurs have on the groups that they are members of. Now, in this presentation, we have 25 minutes, about 20 of those now to be precise. So I'm really going to focus on the top two, okay? And the reason for that is not just are they particularly more interesting? They're not, but there is some more meat there to really get into. And I think those will give people more useful takeaways from this presentation as well. So a number of years ago, I conceptualized an idea for a study where I would longitudinally look at 3 entrepreneurs, and I would explore how they interacted with their families and their employees. And I was probably a little bit mad. I was inspired by a lot of stuff that was going on in the early 2000s, and people really trying to push kind of barriers with research methodologies around narrative, especially, and this idea of kind of multi-author narratives. Because when we begin to look at a lot of entrepreneurship research, actually we're very reliant often on single author perspectives. So we look at one person's viewpoint and we take a group of them and we say, okay, that's it. But actually that's quite flawed, because we know that as individuals, when we look at narrative, when we look at interviews, we do craft the truth, let's say. So for me, it was about, how do I get to greater truth value? And I said, well, you know what, actually, what I want to do is I want to look at the entrepreneur, a member of their family, one of their employees, and from that, I want to craft a multi-author narrative, or a thick narrative. And people at the time said, well, this isn't going to work. Nobody's going to agree to it, for one, because it was quite a lot of access it required over a long period of time. And secondly, it's a difficult thing to do, because then how do you codify and develop that? So I started approaching people, and for about 6 months, I was knocked back by everybody I spoke to. Eventually, I got to 4 people, who then became 3 people, because one person pulled out, who agreed to be involved in the study. And they agreed to give me access and agreed to get their family involved. And even then, there were difficulties in the study. So one of my case studies, for instance, I didn't get to speak to an employee until nearly the final round of interviews because they kept sacking people. Not necessarily for negative reasons, but they did, and that affected the sort of nature of what I was doing. So again, that sort of dealing with adversity in research has been quite important for me as part of this journey. This then left me with huge amounts of transcriptable data, which I had to sort of push down. And I created a methodology to do that, where I explored what I called significant events. This happens in critical discourse analysis. We talk about the idea of finding things that are significant, and we have various methodologies for doing that. Because I had so much data, I had to come up with a neater, sort of neatish way of doing it. So for me, I said, well, a significant event, if more than one person in the narrative mentions it, that's probably something I should be looking into. And you could then pull other bits of narrative around that to add more context if you needed to, but that would give you the core of an event that you could then begin to examine from a research perspective. So I honed down on these significant events, and this became the meat of how I began to develop my analysis. And these significant events gave me a broad range of insights, and some that were quite surprising. For instance, I found out that one of my research participants, although I'd known them for a number of years, was a Jehovah's Witness. I'd never known that, never talked about it, never come up a conversation. But that in itself had some really interesting insights into it. I learned about life stories and histories and very interesting perspectives on people. But it wasn't an easy methodology. So there is a thing there about how do we balance methodologies with access, and how do we create more interesting methodologies. Had I the access to technology I now have, I probably could have done something that was a bit neater actually, but time has moved on somewhat. I also conducted a very wide-ranging literature review to underpin my thesis, because actually my thesis is very, very broad. We look at an awful lot of areas, so I need to look at literature in family business and entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial teams, and then I also need to look at a broad range of other issues. And then as I began to analyze the data, new issues emerged. So I talked about the point about Jehovah's Witnesses. I had to become a minor expert, an individual expert in entrepreneurship in the context of Jehovah's Witnesses, and entrepreneurship in a religious context, something I'd never thought about approaching. So my thesis grew and developed and morphed. In today's presentation, I'm going to pick out findings that kind of come into 4 distinct areas, which I hope echo those 2 initial questions I was talking about. So one is the nature of families and what I found about the nature of families. 2 is the role of families in terms of their role as a provider of resources. The 3rd is the role of families in terms of the influence they have on people. And this I think is really interesting, how the families we grow up in influence our norms and values, and how that influences our behavior. And finally, a concept that I like to call identity-driven entrepreneurship. And I'll explain why that's relevant later. I don't think many people here are particular entrepreneurial theorists, but if I say that for a long time in entrepreneurship, we've talked about the idea of opportunity versus necessity, I think there's a really interesting conversation we had about identity driving entrepreneurial action and activity. And that point will come about as we move forwards. So first of all, here is a very complex diagram, but let me talk about it. This really summarizes my perspective on the nature of families. So we have 2 axes here. We have social construction and social relationship. What I mean by that is social construction is referring to effectively how has the individual built the family with not just what we would call consanguineous or blood and marital relationships, but also with social relationships. So how much is the family formed by them? And then this idea of social relationships is effectively how much consanguinity do we see in the family? So if a family has a lot of familial blood and marital relationships, then we would expect it to be much closer to the individual and much less constructed. And that's what we begin to see here in the diagram. We have these 4 distinct elements. Very close to the individual, we find that lots of people identify the concept of a family in a relatively traditional context. Probably not more than 4 degrees separated from themselves. So generally, first cousins would be included in those family groups, but they don't tend to go much wider than that. And for a lot of people, actually, they were much more constrained in the nature of the study. We then have this idea of a wider family group. And in this family, we begin to see a blend of both blood and marital relationships and social relationships. This is where people begin to include friends as family members. Also, they might include much more distant relatives. So here, in terms of consanguinity, we might see, third, fourth allied relationships. We might get into second and third cousins here, or very much more distant family members, actually, in some cases. Okay. We then had a very interesting construct appear, which is the idea of a business family. And this came about in a couple of different ways. One of them was as an influencer group, actually helping to develop products. And one of them was the members of a business who had whose relationships had evolved beyond what I suppose you would call a traditional professional relationship. Now, those 3 families, the size of the relative circles represents generally the size of the group. So families were quite constrained, wider families were larger, business families, again, tended to be quite constrained. Beyond those groups, I also identified a broad, what I call suprafamilial group. Now, the easiest way to contextualize this is to think of something like a religious group. So these are broadly social groups who may act both as a family group themselves, but may also act through an individual's family groups. And they're interesting because they seem to have a disproportionate, let's say, influence on individual action and activity through this process of normative forces. And that's the other thing we see represented here in the diagram, the idea of norms, the idea of these forces that change, affect, and alter our behavior. And we have both what I call internal and external normative forces. So internal normative forces are forces within the families that affect them. External normative forces are forces beyond the family that are affecting all of the familial groups. And this broadly reflects what's come out from my PhD. There is some of this in other people's literature, most definitely. Issues around family and wider family have come out before. But the idea of this business family and these suprafamilial entities, this is quite new, and I think it's going to be quite interesting to begin to explore more. Now, what families do, we've talked about the idea of normative forces, and we'll return to that in a second. But one of the obvious things families do is they provide resources. And I began to put this into the context of what I call resource roles. Now, there is lots of literature on family resourcing, but it's not very well brought together. So when we talk about resources, we tend to be drawing on quite a broad literature, and I want to try and pull it into some more silos, let's say. So I identified these groups, one of them being advisors, one being staffers, and one being investors. And that's to say that generally the resources an entrepreneur draws on from their family or from their familial groups is advice, physical staffing, and investment. Now, the selection of those roles was quite interesting because as you began to dig into the data itself, what you saw was a picture of lots of different reasons driving why people were choosing to access resources from their family. One of them was the needs of the business and the entrepreneur. And this could be both personal and professional needs, okay? All of the entrepreneurs in my study accessed family for both personal and professional reasons to support their businesses. It could be that actually there were particular individuals in a network they wanted to access, or particular holes they wanted to bridge. So coming in sort of Ronald Burt's structural hole theory idea of how do we bridge holes in network? Well, families can be one way to do that. And finally, choice about role selection and the entrepreneur's own self-determination in accessing resources also played a role in that. Now, families are a powerful resource base, and while they are not the only one, again, I would argue, based on my data, based on data from other people, they definitely play a disproportionate role in resourcing businesses. There is a bit of a debate in my mind about whether they are the only reason that, say, a nascent entrepreneur translates into being an entrepreneur. So there is lots of data that says if you have an entrepreneurial parent, you are more likely to be an entrepreneurial family member or mentor. And that's validated by big data sets like the GEM study, which is the Global Enterprise Monitor. However, when you dig down, there's also a lot that says, well, actually, if you've got that but don't have the practical experience, you're not likely to create a successful business. And for me, I think there is an argument that families don't just motivate, and entrepreneurial families don't just motivate people, they actively give them opportunities to access the experience of being entrepreneurial as well. And that's something I think we sometimes overlook in the literature. There is another mechanism here, which is quite interesting as well, just as an aside, that actually if your family is too entrepreneurial, it can act as a disincentive to entrepreneurial action and make it less likely you'll be an entrepreneur. And that's come out of, again, parts of what I've explored and a couple of studies that have looked at that as well. So again, quite an interesting an aside there. Probably slightly more interestingly for me was the concept of norms and values, these behavioral influences. And what I saw was that norms and values had really wide-ranging effects on the process of entrepreneurship. They could change people's businesses, they could change the nature of the business, they could change the market that the business traded in. There were really interesting examples, again, from the Jehovah's Witness study, where because of certain norms and values, they wouldn't work in certain markets. Or from one of the other cases where, because of certain things in their background, they seemed more likely to take a certain approach to doing something. I'm sorry I can't be more specific. I'm kind of talking about this in very general terms, but as the study isn't finished and all the data isn't fully anonymized, I'm trying really hard not to slip and mention people's names or identify research subjects, okay? Norms and values can be transferred by a range of familial structures. So families, yep, great, but wider families, social groupings, those business families, those suprafamilial structures, they all transfer norms and values into individuals that have an output effect on being entrepreneurial. So again, our kind of binary viewpoint of, well, family business and that leads to entrepreneurship actually probably needs to be quite a lot broader. Transference, acceptance, and application of these values is a mediated process, but I put here resistance is often futile. If you imagine it's a bit like being the little boy with his finger in the dam. If you want a resource from your family, the trade-off is you are going to have to take on board some of their norms and values. It's nearly impossible to avoid that. It does happen in reverse, but again, you are one person swiping at a whole family's norms and values, so it's much more difficult in that way. In some cases, even the perception of overstepping a familiar norm, so not actually doing it, not actually transgressing in a meaningful way, but just the perception of transgressing was enough to trigger action by the entrepreneur. And I found that fascinating. And actually what's interesting is, even in those cases where action might have been triggered by a negative input, sometimes it generated positive activity. So for instance, somebody might perceive they were ignoring their family, but then actually redouble their efforts to develop their business as a way to spend more time with them later. So really kind of complex actions and interactions that I only actually could begin to capture because of that thick narrative. And as I said before, the links between some of this and nascent venturing, I think, is actually weaker than maybe we first admit to. And that's something I think bears much more exploration as we go forwards. Now, for me, the next slide, this idea of identity, was actually one of the most interesting things I came across. And I'm trying not to be very specific because this, for me, may be part of really what my PhD hinges on. But in entrepreneurship, my view, and people argue this about, but my view is that very often we end up in this kind of position where we talk about, is entrepreneurship driven by necessity or opportunity? Actually, for me, this ignores this other idea of entrepreneurship being driven by identity. I had a number of cases where actually what's driving people to go entrepreneurial was because it was a safe space for them. So if you take, say, people who have a strong religious belief, even where that religion might run contrary to entrepreneurial action, entrepreneurship becomes a safe space for them, because in that space, they can control the morality, the sensibility, the activity in a way they can't do that when they work in other fields. And more broadly, we call this identity salience. And some people have looked at this, but not really begun to develop it. And I think here there is a really interesting set of questions about, does identity and identity through families begin to be a driver of entrepreneurial action and activity? So, bringing this to a close, because as you know, whether you're aware or not, that's actually about 22 minutes so far. I'm doing quite well. I have some key takeaways that I think might be interesting for all of us just to consider. So, firstly, for me, familial structures definitely play an important role in shaping entrepreneurs. They do that through that process of transferring norms, through access to practical experience, and through resourcing the entrepreneur through those resource roles. They provide a range of resources, both practical and emotional, but the decision to access these effectively rests with the entrepreneur and is a process of mediating whether that entrepreneur wants to access norms or wants to be affected by them as to whether they go and engage with them. And finally, identity as a construct appears to be a powerful and under-researched driver for entrepreneurial action and activity. And for me, I think that is an area that bears really interesting potential further fruit for other researchers. Now, I would like to say as well, finally, the whole idea of doing research in thick narrative as well, I think is very interesting. And I would encourage anybody who's thinking about research and who's thinking about ways to conduct, say, surveys, to really look at other versions of discourse and kind of conversational types of analyses. When we look at people from multiple perspectives and we're able to get a more rounded picture of something that's happening, the data is really fascinating. Yes, it's harder. Yes, it's given me a lot of trouble on my journey, but ultimately I think actually it's been more interesting and I've taken more from it as a process. So all that rests for me to say is, first of all, thank you very much. There is a Q&A chat option, so please do use that via Zoom, or I'm happy to take any questions if people want to just unmute and ask me a question. Always happy to talk about that. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Yeah, let's get started on the Q&A.